Morning, everyone. We are here this morning for the Village of Glencoe Board of Trustee Finance Committee, and we'd like to call the meeting to order.
I will do a roll call. Trustee Rubin.
Yes.
Just for the record, Trustee Rubin is joining remotely. Trustee Hallwax.
Here.
Trustee Mealopoulos.
Here.
We have a physical quorum and all members are present.
Moving on to the next item on the agenda, we have public comment. Anyone here interested in addressing the board with non-agenda items may do so at this time. No public comment. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, we have the consideration of our minutes. Members of the committee would like to, I guess we can go for a roll call unless we have any comments on the minutes.
Just do a voice vote on this one. So we just need a motion and a second and a
Can I
voice
have
vote.
a motion?
Motion to accept the minutes.
Second, sorry.
You can-
I can second.
Yeah.
All right,
And then just all in favor.
all in favor?
Yes.
That's that.
Next item on the agenda, we will review our monthly financial reports. So,
Thank you. Included in the packet for this morning is the September financial reports. Going through a few of the highlights for the general fund. Our property taxes are still running higher than last year by $4.2 million. We did not receive any property tax revenue in September. We did have a projected receipt that we were expecting in September, but that's because we were expecting receipts to be a little late again. And shockingly, Cook County was on time, so that's good news. And we're running 102.7% of budget, so anything that we receive between now and the end of the year will just be in excess of what we were expecting for the year. Sales taxes are continuing to level off. They're less than last year and the monthly budget. This would be for June sales. We're running at 65.5% of budget, so we're running about 10% down from last year. From what we can tell, this just continues to be the difference year over year between non-recurring sales and auto trends. Continue to analyze that as we get more information from the properties. This month, our parking fees, sewer charges, E-911 surcharges were all higher than last year and monthly budget. Not a great month for some of our revenues. We just missed some of our budgetary targets. Nothing to be concerned about at this point. We're still talk about the surplus at the end of this presentation. But certainly our parking, as you can tell, anecdotally is still doing very well. Our expenditures are higher than last year and at 67.4% budget, and some of that's just timing. On the water side, our volumetric revenue is running a little less than last year's at 69.1% of budget. We still have summer usage that will be billed, so that number could still go a little bit higher. But right now we're running about $116,000 less than last year. And that's just entirely dependent on irrigation patterns and weather patterns. Our fixed charge revenue is on target, higher than last year. It's about $20,000 up, just shy of the 75% for this time of the year. And the expenditures are less than last year, 57.2% of budget, down by about 1.2 million from last year. That's entirely timing, as our water main project is going to be kicking off still this year. So we'll see those expenditures hit a little bit later. And I'm going to turn it over to Stella to talk a little bit about the golf course.
Thank you. The September did turn out to be a great month for us. We were 25% over budget. Rounds, of course, all of that. We had really good weather, and one of that does have a little bit of an impact on us, but right now we're still exceeding budgeted revenue, so we're not worried about that right now. Special events, we had family service, shotgun, fundraising event by us, and we had another church from North Throat kind of shotgun They will not be coming back with us next year because we'll be under construction, but family service will because they don't have a dinner afterwards. We also had our second annual stargazing event, which sold out in about 2 hours. We had 200 people. It was, the event is growing annually. We had 30 kids from New Trier participate, helping out the little kids. We had a Northwestern professor there with, one of his huge telescopes. The residents loved it. It was a very successful event. Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club has received two $50,000 pledges. One is part of a $200,000 pledge. The other one was a friend of Ellis Goodman's who donated $50,000. They're still actively pursuing about 3 or 4 more pledges in the $100,000 plus range. That's my report.
So, moving on to the other funds, there's not much to report from last month on the debt service, motor fuel tax and capital projects. We just continue to incur expenses for the stormwater project and nothing to really report on the motor fuel tax fund. Debt service fund, we've accumulated enough in that fund to make the principal and interest payments that will be due in December. So we'll see those come out either late November or early December. On the personnel side, we're continuing to see an increase year over year. The difference is 1.8 million. The lion's share in the difference year over year are the salaries related to filling vacant positions that were vacant last year and are filled this year. And also the timing of the pension costs of those transfers, since we received property taxes so late last year. Those pension costs should be catching up around December time. So you'll see that difference be a little less, but there was an increase year over year, so we'll still see that kind of creeping up. When we move on to projections, our annual revenue projections, just looking at the general fund, revenue only without expenditures, we're running about 1.3 million. So I said, this month was a little bit of a slower month for revenues, but not something to be concerned about. On a year-to-date basis, we're still doing well. When we back out that one-time grant funding that we received, we're still running $619,000 over the revenue budget. So that's a good news story. On the water fund side, similar story. We're overall in the water fund, we're running about just shy of 50,000 over our revenue budget projection. When we add expenditures into that equation and what we're projecting on spending between now and the end of the year, the general fund has a planned drawdown of just shy of 150,000. That is compared to the budget of a 3.1 million drawdown. We'll talk a little bit more as we get into the capital fund about why that is the case. Some of that is offsetting from the revenue surplus, but some of that is also projects that we expect to continue into next year. When we back out grant funding from that number, that is not right. We'll come back to that. Oh, that is right. When we back out grant funding from that number, it's about 850,000 that would be drawn down from this year. On a water fund basis, we are projecting a $1.2 million drawdown. That was based off of a planned drawdown of 2 million. And just a reminder, the lion's share of those dollars that are coming out of the fund reserve are bond proceeds that were issued in a previous year. Our fund reserves at month end in the general fund are at 18.6 million. It's about 76% of operating expenditures, and the water fund's at 6.7 at 126% of operating expenditures, again, because of the bond proceeds that are in the fund reserve. From an inflationary standpoint, CPI for September was 2.4%. Our commodities are still running higher than last year. We've talked about this every month this year, and about 70% of budget. So they're still within budgetary targets. It's just that we are noticing that those prices are leveling out at a higher place than they were this time last year. Similar story for contractual services, higher than last year and at 63.7% of budget. And I'm happy to answer any questions from the treasurer's report. Nothing groundbreaking this month. This is kind of a continuation of what we've been seeing. Okay, so I will turn it over to Margaret to talk a little bit about CIP.
Good morning. So your monthly update can be found in your packet on page 52 and 53, and your quarterly update on page 54. And so there are a few items going in front of the board for approval tomorrow night. We have the Village Hall second floor and public safety renovation and council chambers upgrade. Going before the board, 1.2 is where the bids came in, so that's what's going to be going to the board for approval tomorrow night. We also have the rectangular rapid flashing beacons, part of our electronic speed monitoring sign and crosswalk improvements going to the board tonight. 2 CSO electric vehicles, which are replacing numbers 698 and 699, and then a parking management license plate reader. And there was more details about those purchases in your board packet. And then we also have just a few other projects. As we've been going through our 25 budget preparation, we've been talking through the capital program and have noted some items that are getting deferred to next year. So that's been updated as well for your CIP update. Anybody have any questions?
Would you just remind me, please, how did we come out on the second floor public safety and council chamber upgrade versus what we thought, where we thought we would be?
So the budgeted number that's included in the FY 24 budget, so the current fiscal year is 1.6. So we're just above that. What I would mention though is that that number that the board is considering tomorrow night doesn't include furniture. So we do know we're going to have to be purchasing chairs and some tables for the council chambers, and then furnishings for the sleeping quarters for the public safety department. We are anticipating that number in the $150,000 to $200,000 range. So that'll be included in next year's budget. We will spend, I would say, a relatively small amount of that 1.62 million this fiscal year. The board approving it tomorrow night does get things rolling, but I would say probably the majority of those expenditures will hit the budget next year.
Does that include the, sorry, I was on mute. Does that include the tech, the speakers and the cameras and all the screens and all that?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
The instruction, there's less things deferred. Is this part of the supply chain challenge? There, things are more back to normal. Able to forecast services and materials. Because in the recent years, we've had a lot of things deferred. It didn't.
I think
strike me
vehicles,
as our fault.
I think vehicles we've caught up, that supply chain has caught up.
Aside from the squad, which was kind of a specialty,
Yeah.
which we knew was gonna take
Custom
several
build.
years, that's a custom build, but yeah, we're actually having a lot of luck with vehicles.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot less deferrals.
Yes, finally getting caught up.
Yeah.
Great.
And all of our, the big news of the month. All of our
should we look
squad.
fancy?
All the squad cars are done.
All of our squad cars are out.
It only took a year and a half.
It's like a long time, but they're clear.
So included in the packet is the first draft of the financial forecast. So I know you've all been through this before. This is part of the budget document and kind of sets the stage for what we will be doing going forward for the next 5 years. So the financial forecast runs through 2020, from 2025 through 2029. I will say that in my 6 years here, this has by far been the most complex budget environment that we have been in. You may have noticed from the financial forecast that we do the numbers in here that were prepared last week reflect a structural deficit. That is already been resolved and kind of a reflection to the board and to the public of the iterative process that we go through in the budget process. We're kind of in the middle of that process, coming to a close of wrapping everything up into a draft budget that will come before the board. The draft budget that will be presented to you next month will not have a structural deficit. It'll be within our financial policies. But right now we're kind of sorting through those items that are nice to have and those items that we necessarily definitely need to have. There are some cost pressures that we'll go through as part of the financial forecast that we've included in the 5-year projection, but then also you'll see as part of the draft budget next month. So just kind of talking through some of these things, the major forecast is focused on the general fund, the water fund, and the motor fuel tax fund, with the idea being that these are generally the funds that have the most activity. Understanding that the 10-year CIP is kind of a different conversation. But the main factors affecting the forecast, obviously, we've talked a lot about inflation, supply and commodities costs. We're seeing those level off, but level off at a higher level. So you'll see that in the financial forecast. We're expecting that to continue for at least the near term. And there are some things that are still going to be subject to supply chain disruptions. We just had a conversation with our water treatment superintendent that we're having some issues. Some plants are having issues getting chemicals. We have been fortunate with the suppliers that we have and the superintendent that we have, that he has been successful in getting those, but there are just still some odd things that are being impacted by supply chain disruptions. We talked a lot about the required contributions to the public safety pension fund. The actuary was here, I think, in August or July. That contribution alone has gone up over $400,000. So just having that as an operational impact has been a challenge for us to navigate. But we knew that this was coming because our contribution has been low the past few years because our staffing has been low. So as we're coming to full staff, we're seeing that expense rise along with that. Prioritization of infrastructure improvements. We were talking about this before the meeting started. You'll see that the 10-year CIP has grown when we do present that to you in November. So understanding what needs to be done sooner rather than later. We're still kind of working through that. You'll see a lot of drawdown of fund balance in the financial forecast that was presented for you today. We're still fine tuning those numbers and prioritizing those projects to spread those out. Really of what, not necessarily all of it needs to be done, but we need to prioritize it. And we also need to be realistic about what we can achieve with the staffing that we have, particularly in the next 5 years, but also in the 10-year as well. So we're still working through that. Debt financing, in the 10-year CIP, we've always talked about referendum bonds versus revenue bonds. This might be a year that we look at federal funding for some of our water projects. With the inflationary environment where it's at, even with the Fed cutting rates, there may be a circumstance that we're better off going with a 0 interest or a low interest loan through the federal or the state government versus bonding on our own. So that will be something that we'll be exploring as well. And just as we do every year, we'll be designing fee structures around cost. I'll get into that in a moment, but we are going to see a couple of larger increases in fee increases presented for your consideration next month, just to make sure that we're keeping up with the rising costs that we're seeing in our infrastructure improvements. As we talked about, I think last month, the property taxes are expected to rise about 3.4%. That is the percentage that is set in accordance with PTO. The Department of Revenue determines that based off of the increase in CPI from December to December. So that goes from December 22 to December 23. And that would apply to all non-home rule units in Illinois. So that, and we'll get into the property tax levy estimate at the end of the meeting. So you can see the full impact of that. So that's incorporated into the forecast. The next two items I wanted to touch on, because these are larger increases than what we've done in the past, What we are recommending for sewer is a 10% increase. What we have been finding as we go backwards 5 years instead of forward 5 years is that every year we're chasing a number with a rate increase and we're never hitting it. And what that means is that it's lagging funding, like the cost of our sewer improvements is increasing and our funding is lagging behind. So what we're trying to do is do a one-time increase to kind of inject funding into that program so that we can keep up with the requirements that we have to evaluate our systems through FWRD and also just maintain our storm and sanitary systems as well. And you'll see more of that, and there's nothing to approve tonight. I just wanted to explain to you that you're going to see that recommendation next month along with the capital improvements that would be funded by that. The garbage services fee, very similar. What we're seeing is the cost to maintain the streets. This also funds our special collection programs. And one new program that we'll be recommending next month is the street rejuvenation process, which Monica can explain a little bit more if you have questions. So we're also recommending that increase to help support those programs. So that's primarily road improvements and recycling and leaf collection that is supported by that.
So those are fees that the village would impose, nothing LRS is passing that.
So it is LRS, it goes through the LRS
It
bill,
does, yeah, but
but
not
it's determined by the village. It's not there for the.
Not there.
Correct. That's a good question. In the forecast, we're seeing telecom tax, PPRT, and use tax declining. Telecom tax has been kind of a dying revenue for a long period of time. We've been projecting that that's been declining, and it has been slowly over time. PPRT, we've talked at length about this. The Department of Revenue made an error last year that over allocated PPRT and now they're pulling it back. So that will be low for at least throughout 2025, and then we should start to see it recover in 26. Use tax is going to continue to decline because of the change in sales tax. The way that the state is applying sales tax, we've seen a rise, even though our sales taxes are down 10%, we've still seen that general level of sales tax increase as use tax is coming down because sales tax is being applied on online sales that were previously reported as use tax. And overall, with the change of the way the state has enforced sales tax, we've seen those taxes rise. They're catching a lot of online sales that they weren't previously catching. Okay, utility tax, vehicle stickers and alarm fees will be predicted to be relatively stable. We will be having a more in-depth conversation about vehicle stickers and what the plan is in terms of a virtual program and the costs associated with that next month. But for the purposes of the forecast, we're projecting that to be relatively stable. The local share of income taxes we're projecting to increase with CPI projections based off of what the Central Budget Office is projecting over the next 5 years. And then building permits you'll see in the forecast are increasing with the planned development of Forest Edge. We're assuming a few homes each year will be constructed. It may be faster or slower, but for the purposes of the forecast, that's what we've assumed. On the expenditure side, salary and contractual costs are rising. We talked at length about inflation costs and then obviously planning for infrastructure.
Can I jump in and just make that as a comment? As we think about our infrastructure plan improvements, I know we've been doing bundling, trying to get these projects to be bigger and combining multiple projects like we've done with some of the water projects, which is great. We get better bang for our buck than some of the larger projects. But I just do want to reiterate that maybe as we think about going forward, like for instance, now we're in October, we should really already, I think, be ready to go to bid with some projects as early in the season next year as possible, because we do get better value when contractors tend to be, they don't have their plate full just yet. So I just want to another mention to that, just something I think we should try to focus on and not just rely on paying more because we're doing things later, but we can save. Penny saved is a penny earned as well. So Thank you.
Yeah, it's a
That's
great
something
point.
to
It's a
think
great
about.
point. And one of the things that we're working ahead really for one of the first times is on water design. We'll have 3 years of water projects on the shelf, which allow us to do that more effectively. And absolutely, I think that's the zone we want to get into. And kind of the routine that we want to get into is that as much pre-work as possible. So when we get to the fiscal year, when we expect to build, we're hitting the market, you know, in the first quarter.
And also to not, to try to, focus on more critical projects sooner before they become
Yep.
super critical. So we do have time to maybe table that project, maybe go into the next year
Right.
versus having to. But we must go and do this now because maybe we're a little too late at the cycle of that, the lifespan of that asset or whatever. So just wanted to reiterate that. Please, thank you.
Great point.
That's a good feedback. Okay, and I'm sorry that this is small, but it is in your packet. You can make it a little bit larger. But this is the actual forecast looking from left to right. We started with this year's budget, what we're projecting for the end of this year. And then what we are tentatively budgeting for 25 and what we would see through 2029. I won't take you through every line, but if you have any questions about specific lines, please let me know. The projections for year end are a combination of what we are seeing from our councils of government in Illinois Municipal League and their publications, what we are seeing locally. And then also on the expenditure side, we get input from all of our departments about what we think we're going to spend for this year. You'll see the impact of the 3.4% increase in the property tax levy. Bringing that across, and I know the library plans to do the same. They presented that to their library board last night. And then you'll also see the leveling off of sales tax. In 25, we're budgeting just over 2.5 million. It was not that long ago that number was sub 2 million. So even though it's it sounds like a sad story that our sales taxes are down, we're still in a much better place today than we were pre-pandemic in terms of sales taxes. And then you'll see in the out years of the building permits that we did include a much higher number. That number is usually about 1.4, 1.5. This year, we're expecting it to end closer to 1.8. So we're projecting 1.9 in the next few years.
We just know that by, we can assume X amount of homes are going to be. People have applied already, I guess we should say.
Well, I think we're looking at it from a Forest Edge standpoint.
Yes.
Particularly,
Yes.
we know that's 29 lots, and trying to spread that over.
And one of those, I'm glad actually that we're pausing in this one because in the village's financial policies, we do have a caveat that the board can consider doing a one-time transfer of one-time revenue into the capital fund to plan for future infrastructure improvements. And this was an opportunity that we identified as, we're not going to have a lot of subdivisions in Glencoe. It doesn't happen very often. This will be kind of a one-time influx of a significant amount of building permit revenue that we are recommending in the draft budget to transfer that into the capital fund so that we reinvest in the infrastructure and not let that money absorb into the general fund, like set it aside.
Just to give you context, based off of numbers of what, we're talking about like a $40,000 permit fee, which might be a little low, but conservative. It's just about $1.2 million in revenue for those 29 lots. So we want to be a little thoughtful about how to use those resources.
And it has changed over time now because of the change in the hands of the property and the change in direction of how it's going to be developed. I think we're assuming like 3 or 4 homes a year.
It might be more than that
And it
based
may
off
be
of the
more.
Cranes article that I read yesterday.
Okay.
Where they're basically saying they're anticipating it's built in 3 years.
Wow,
So.
okay, that's great. Wonderful.
So we'll see.
So that'd be 29 times 40.
Yeah.
Third.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
So we're budgeting conservatively right now, but our hope is that it would have a net zero impact on the budget because you take the revenue in and then you would send it out to the capital fund, like transfer it out. So it wouldn't necessarily impact.
Yeah, and what we want to be mindful of is to not be dependent on those resources for the operating budget.
Places for eating tax are projected to be relatively steady. We haven't made any major changes there. If the use tax go out and then parking fees are rebounding, so we're reflecting that in the forecast, and I'm sure you're all feeling it whenever you come downtown. And then you'll see that kick up of the sewer fees. We're just to kind of give you an idea of what we're dealing with, we were budgeting about 830,000 in sewer charges, and we're only projecting about 730,000 this year. So we're definitely shy of our target of what we need to fund the program. So that is part of the reason why we're recommending increasing that. In our other revenue, we do have quite a bit of interest income. I'm expecting that to stay elevated for a while. There's several items in that other category grouped together. But we've been fortunate to have kind of a windfall. That's the other side of supplies and commodities costs going up. We are seeing a big increase in interest revenues. That's a good news story. On the expenditure side, obviously our largest expenses are salaries. As a service-based organization, you would expect that. We are expecting to see our overtime level off, but as we've discussed, particularly in public safety, as we're bringing on so many new officers, it is going to take time to get them all trained. They still need to go to fire and police academy in some cases, and EMT basic training. So that does require us to backfill on overtime, our shifts to make sure that we have coverage. So we do expect that to stay elevated for a few years and then hopefully level off. The pension fund, we talked quite a bit about. We're moving from a $2.7 million contribution to almost 3.2 million. That's based off of the actuary's recommendation, and that's a combination of the census growth, which is a fancy way of saying filling vacancies in the department, and then also just kind of missing the investment target that we were hoping for this year. And also as a result of the pension funding policy that the finance committee and the village board approved in trying to pay down that unfunded liability over the past year. Commodities and services, we're projecting out relatively stable, kind of expecting that to level off. The community grants number we left in at 150 as a placeholder, but that will be determined ultimately when the community grants committee meets. And that's a capital number. This is a big scary number, but don't let it scare you. Right now it's at 6.9 million. We're still working through what is going to be prioritized for next year. We do have some big projects and big items in that number. One of them is 1.2 million for the fire squad, which we don't know is going to be delivered next year. So that may be something that goes into 2026. It all depends on how fast that process goes.
Could we back up 1 second?
Yep.
Yeah,
I
the
know.
projected fund balance.
Yep, I know what you were gonna ask, and that's why I went back. Thank you, Gary. So this is why I wanted to caveat that we're still working on the budget, because the projected fund balance, you can see that we are very ambitious in our drawdowns for capital. In 25, we have almost 7 million. In 26, we have 3.8. 27, we have 2.6, and then it drops off to 775. So we are refining those numbers as we are starting to look at that and realizing that's not feasible. So if we left it that way, we would be at 38% fund balance at the end of 25, drawing down to 22% in 26, 11% in 27, and 8% in 28. We do have a general fund balance policy of 25%, so that is not feasible. And we are going to have to do some work on that 10-year CIP before it comes back to you in November to make sure that we're aligning with that policy.
But I do think a point that's worth making, and one of the reasons that we do this financial forecast is to outline the fact that these costs are not going down. That the revenue streams that perhaps we've relied on in the past may or may not sustain what we need to invest. And I think as we have taken a fresh look at that CIP, getting better numbers in the out years particularly is a priority that we are focused on because we've just seen the cost of some of these projects change dramatically. 50% difference from where it may have been pre-pandemic. I don't know that that's going to come back down. And I think that reality of the CIP, and it is, this fiscal year is 77 million, not including the clubhouse. Next year is 129 because we are working harder. 2022. Can't
It's a
remember.
little less than that.
Yeah.
It's like 100.
But including the clubhouse, which we didn't necessarily include in that 77. So the reality of things is that we may just have to spread out investments further than we already are in order to afford them. We may have to defer them indefinitely in certain ways and kind of reprioritize where those dollars go. That's what we're working through with Public Works to try to get a better sense of the stability and quality of some of our underground infrastructure particularly. So one of the things next year we're going to get started on, or we'd like to get started on, is a stormwater master plan that assesses the condition, the size, the quality of our stormwater infrastructure that we haven't touched. We've invested a lot in stormwater over the last 20 or so years. But it's indicative of a bit of a changed environment, and we want to be practical about it. To Nikki's point, it's impractical to say we're just going to draw down from fund balance and bring the fund balance way too low. So we're going to have to get creative as to how we package some of that, what sort of financing we look at. To Nikki's point, trying to avail ourselves perhaps of federal programs that we haven't in the past because our borrowing costs were low enough. They didn't necessitate that. That's flipped a little bit. And what sort of partnership efforts, what sort of opportunities exist out there. Dudley's words that he frequently outlines ring in my ears a lot. I've seen the future and it's expensive. When you talk about infrastructure, that's very true. So of the things that we do, there's the day-to-day things, right? It's the public safety and public works services that we provide every day. That's one big piece of the puzzle. The other big piece of the puzzle is infrastructure. And I do think we're going to have to sit and really, with better data, talk about what it looks like. And a 10-year CIP is hard enough as it is, but we're starting to talk about how do we even look at 20 years out and begin that planning process and the cycle of replacement. We've felt that with the water distribution system. We underinvested in that for a long time. And now we're trying to play catch up. And that's really hard to do, especially as prices tick up. So we want to be mindful of that too. Lack of investment often means more investment in the future. And so we, again, not to over speak on this subject, but those lines are the ones that are particularly of concern to us.
It's a good segue into the water fund.
Just want to maybe one of your kind of question or thought popped in.
Yeah.
Is it worth our time to try to do some of this budget season so that we're going to embark on November and December earlier so that we can have our budget approved earlier in, let's say, this year and start to think about go out to bid for projects now for the beginning of next year, which might help us save some money.
Yes.
Mentioned.
You might have a line into our
I know,
brains
I realized
because
you've been
Because we
sitting.
did part in June.
we had that conversation. You know, our budget process this year has felt probably the most rushed that it's felt in a while. And that's for a few reasons, not the least of which is fall creeps up on all of us, but we have already talked about pushing the process back at least 2 months next year, and maybe even more than that, so that we're kind of nearing the end at this point, rather than kind of just starting. It's not, obviously, the budget process is almost a 12-month process as it is.
You're always on
right?
your mind.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of having next year's projects, next year's construction projects. Even up the whole year, we can keep building things, but
Yes.
next, when we think about the CIP, have it approved, ready to go now.
Yes, and it's a delicate balance because then you're trying to project, when you back up the process, when you're trying to project your end, it gets tricky, it's hard, but it's gonna be hard whenever you do that. And to your point, there's a lot of advantages to having it done sooner and just being ready to
We all know
go
what we're
ahead of the
doing.
game.
Isn't our fiscal year also different?
Fiscal year used to be
Yeah.
March 1, yeah.
Maybe,
Yes.
I'm not saying you can go back, but just maybe we'll
Yes.
just change our kind of fiscal year, budget calendar year.
Yeah.
So that get ahead.
Started
To try to
August.
save.
Well, I was just, anecdotally, I've been commenting to Nikki on the number of communities who are January 1 fiscals who approved their budgets in August. Now, I think that's a little bit
Yeah.
crazy, but the point that they're kind of getting to that is it gives us a head start. And now the board can begin to approve projects in November to start in February, as opposed to approving projects in February to start in April. And it's trying to move those timelines. So I think that's exactly what we're going to be doing next year. Yep.
No problem. Okay, so that's a good segue into the water fund. We had talked about doing a water rate study this year. But in conjunction with that conversation, we've also had conversations about these multidisciplinary projects where we're planning water main, sewer main, sidewalk at the same time. And what we've kind of come to a conclusion is it doesn't really make sense to do the water rate study before we kind of revamp our CIP to align with those multidisciplinary projects. So what we're doing is planning for a rate study next year after we revisit the CIP a little bit. We are, as kind of a sneak peek into next month, we are planning our first kind of project that's going to align. It's going to be the Denby Road water main, and there'll be sidewalk and other components to that next year. So that'll be kind of the kickoff into that change of how we're looking at the CIP. So with the CIP as it exists today, we're recommending a 6% increase in water rates. We have changed a lot since we did our water rate study. I think it was in 2016. Not the least of which we deferred the replacement of the water tower because of the replacement of the Skokie Lagoon main and the receipt of ARPA funds to fund that. But there's also been changes in the order of the water main replacements and the projects that we have done. So we've developed our own internal model to adjust because we have to, right? It's just like a budget. As soon as you kick off, nothing changes. So that is in line with our internal model, what we are planning for the 10-year CIP as it stands today. And then it also happens to align with the water rate study that was done anyway. So that is what we're recommending. It's a 6% for 2025, and then we're anticipating a rate study after the revamp of the CIP next year, so then we can look for the next 5 to 10 years out. So for next year, we have 3.1 million in water main replacements and plant improvements slated for 2025. We talked about the water tank delay. And then looking into the 10-year CIP as it stands right now, we have 22.8 million in water main, production system and critical plant improvements in the next 10 years. Obviously, it does not include the water plant. That would be a separate discussion. And we're also anticipating potentially some changes with the lead service line and those requirements, and that will have to be reprogrammed in the CIP. You'll see when we present the draft budget, we have elevated the number of lead service line reimbursements that we're budgeting for and kind of increased some of our budgetary line items to account for increased participation as we try to ramp up that program to get those lead service lines out. And then I'll make sure Monica can comment. But I think with the new leak detection equipment that we received, we are finding a lot of those leaks that are in lead service lines. So that's also expediting the replacement of those lines as well. And then, as we mentioned earlier, our infrastructure improvements in the water fund could potentially be done with water bonds, accumulated fund balance, and then potential loans or even grants if we find programs that would comply with that. Okay, looking at the water fund, this fund balance is a little bit better with what we have planned. Although we'll see where the rate study lies. We're projecting 6% rate increase this year and then kind of falling off next year. I think it's another 6% and then 4% kind of falling off there in the 5-year forecast. But again, that's going to be modified as we modify the capital plan. Other than that, revenues are projected to be relatively stable. Our next alternate revenue bond was scheduled for 2027. That would be another $5 million issue. We're still spending down the proceeds of our last water issue. 2026 will be the last program as part of that funding. And then in a fund balance, we're projecting to end this year with a 92% fund balance. And then drawing that down to 20% next year, basically because we're exhausting those revenue bonds. And then jumping back up to 63% in 2027 if we issue another $5 million in bonds. So that will basically be kind of a self-replenishing cycle in the water fund. Moving on to the MFT fund, we haven't seen motor fuel taxes decline, although with the governor's elimination of the grocery tax, he's also promised some capital improvements as well. And I can't remember if there's any allocation to motor fuel tax, but I'm projecting those revenues out to be relatively stable. The revenues in this fund primarily consist of our local share of the state motor fuel tax and then also our local fuel tax at our gas station, and then interest income as well, which has been higher in recent years. Consistent with what we have done previously in our 10-year CIP, our plan is to aggregate MFT funds to supplement the road program. So if we do a program again in 2027, we have another $600,000 that we would draw down from the motor fuel tax fund that would supplement a larger road program. Questions before we go to debt? Okay. So our debt limit is 99.2 million in tax year 2023. No one is suggesting that. It's just a point of information. We currently have 21.8 million in outstanding GO debt and 1.5 million in an IEPA loan that's repaid through the water fund through water charges. Our current annual payment is about 3.1 million in debt. And then our historic high, when we look back to 2008, which was the most amount of debt that Glencoe has had in our records, adjusted for CPI and inflation, in today's dollars, that would be 3.6 million. So we're still under the historic kind of watermark there. We also have 5.1 million in remaining and limited taxing authority. You might remember that we utilized those bonds for Tudor Court. That is a bonding resource that the board can tap into without a referendum. If we have emergency funding or a special project, we can utilize that authority that is allocated to us from the Department of Revenue. And then our final recommendations would be pending further review of the CIP. Okay, police pension, we've talked a lot about this. Our required contribution is a $444,000 increase. The forecast includes contribution estimates per our funding policy. So we are seeing those contribution levels rise, assuming that we will reach full staffing. And what they're expecting to fix anything. But then we are expecting to see that contribution level off. That is the goal of the funding policy that we put into place. It's to slowly elevate our contributions to pay down that unfunded liability and then level off the contribution. So it's something that we can plan for and it doesn't cause these large spikes in contributions that we're dealing with right now.
Nikki, if I just add
yeah.
one thing, what I think this particular exhibit spotlights is why when President Rowan and I talk with our legislators, we talk about the necessity of not being short-sighted on pension sweeteners. So in 2008, the village's annual contribution was about $1.2 million. In 2029, so 20 years later, will be just under 3.5. So it's tripled in 20 years. That is an unsustainable reality. And so these are the kinds of things when we're talking to our legislators, we articulate and are able to show. And Glencoe is in a much better position than many like municipalities across the state. And we are very thoughtful, very complete in our expectation that we will fund these as a first priority within the budget. So when Nikki's talking about one of the big struggles with this year is we've got almost $500,000 in new spending just to cover pension liability. That comes off the top. So we're not, trying to create $500,000 in new revenue because we can't. We don't have the authority to do so. This is an important number as we look at our long-term financial liabilities, is to understand how this number will continue to change. I think the policy that the board enacted in 2021 is going to help, to Nikki's point, keep it from being like this, but it's gonna keep going up. It's not gonna drop. It's gonna keep going up. So that's where those concerns really lie for us. But I think it's just a point worth making in this context.
A point of clarification of that $500,000 is that, we may be able to capture some of that with revenue increase, but it's also competing with the elevated costs of our consistent services that we maintain. So all of the commodities and supplies and services that we provide the community are costing us more to contain. So that's all competing, and they're competing resources for the same.
Well, not to mention the people that we
Right.
employ to
Right.
perform those services. And so, yeah, this year was a uniquely complicated year from a budgetary standpoint as we look at that substantial increase. It is what it is. And so we work through that. But again, that's where when we circle back, and we were just with Senator Morrison last week, and President Rowan very, very thoughtfully said, this is a problem. Don't make it worse for us. And it's interesting because when you do go back to 2011, when the pension system was broken apart into tiers, the main thing that has changed since then in the new dialogue about potentially closing the gap between those tiers is that the state at that same time removed from our annual revenue stream substantial income tax revenue. Nobody's talking about giving that back. So it would be a double hit for communities like us, particularly who have limited revenue generation opportunities, to have to both absorb a more significant pension liability and not have any revenue that we at least were able to depend on back then. We're at 6.67% roughly of income tax from the state. It used to be 10. So if we work every year in our councils of government to try to recapture some portion of that from the state, and it's a substantial revenue loss for us. So
So going to think of the unpopular decision of over time, lowering levels of services and the number of people and things that we do, I mean, it seems it's the only lever we have.
well, it's a great question. I think, we've talked about it around the edges. I don't know that we're in a position where we would need to make a dramatic decision in the short term, but I do think it's
Over
as
5
we,
to 10 years.
as we project it out, it's a real question.
Because you could have natural attrition and things like that.
There is a limitation, there's a limitation to it, because to certain degrees, there's only so much you can dial back. We can't really dial back public safety services, right? The need is there. And we're seeing increased pressures, particularly on the police side, and the EMS side, to support the community. On the public works side, there are a series of things. We're just talking about infrastructure, right? Part of keeping your investment solid is maintaining it. So the maintenance that has to happen during the course of the life of that infrastructure is also a necessary expenditure to limit the replacement cycle, to limit the cost of that replacement. So there are limitations, and there's the argument could be made that the village can cut back in certain areas. I think that's probably true, but I think we have to have a pretty frank conversation with the community about what that means. And so it's not an easy thing. And you'll remember when we had the conversations about sidewalk plowing as a good example. And there was a thought that would be an area where the village could dial back a service level expectation. And the community was anything but supportive of that. And what we instead did was invested $500,000 in new equipment. So it's which has been a good investment from the standpoint of the efficiency and the quality of the service. But cutting back those kinds of things is going to get harder.
So we don't see, none of us have seen broad waste abuse, we don't see that. So Joe, you're right. This is so, it just is. But, we have not seen our residents, okay, let's cut back something. And the lowest hanging fruit was, there are many lovely communities that say, take care of your sidewalks. I was visiting some pals in Alexandria, Virginia, a lovely, prosperous community. And, they have less snow, but it's the responsibility of the residents to take care of it. But when we thought about that here, people were out with torches and pitchforks and stuff, and I don't necessarily blame them. So the first choice is not to cut we can't cut the infrastructure, the place will disappear. And nobody really wants us to cut services. They just don't. Now maybe at some point it'll just get unsustainable, but right now we're going to try to do all of it. What we can't do what some municipalities do, which is pay restaurants to come. We don't have the money. Some of our neighbors, which have business, and business tax based stuff, they get to do that. We can't. But we're going to fight like hell not to cut. services because our residents don't want us to. That may change. And I think we probably should consider periodically a trial balloon to see, because that's when you can find out. But the last trial balloon was shot down in a hurry. And it was a totally reasonable thing. I mean, Glencoe would still be a lovely, excellent place if we didn't think there were sidewalks. Might have been easy for me to say I don't have any sidewalks. But still, it would be a lovely place, but the residents just weren't going for it.
The one thing I will say is there's no doubt we, at the staff level, and I think at the board level too, have a real question of how do we make sure we're supporting components of our economy that are meaningful to us, and that is all of our business districts, right? All three of them. There's 3 car dealerships that have sustained a significant portion of our operating costs and our investments in our infrastructure in the last 20 years that they've been there. Car sales are fickle and may change. I do think part of the comprehensive planning process was to think about the west side of the Edens and to say, well, let's make sure that we're always focused on that. The Central Business District is doing great, right? It's as successful as it's been in maybe a generation or two, but it faces headwinds, and it's not easy. Business is expensive to open and operate, and I do think the village taking an active role as a facilitator is probably the best that we can hope to do, as opposed to a financer, right? And that's what you're seeing some of our neighboring communities who have long struggled to have vibrant business districts. They're saying, well, I guess if we want a vibrant business district, we're going to have to inject some cash into it. So that's their mindset, right? And they have the cash to do that. We don't have the cash to do that. So what else can we do? What are the tools that are available to us? We may have to go down the path being thoughtful about redevelopment and what that means. The comprehensive plan is talking about that, is proposing some of that. That's not going to be uniformly popular in the community. But it is more than just, when we look at it, all of us look at it, it's more than just creating something that perhaps the community is asking for in the form of multifamily housing, for instance. But it's also helping to drive the economic generator that the downtown business district is. How do things like the library shared information? They have 70,000 visits a year in and out of that building. A lot of those people are Glencoe residents. A lot of them aren't. So they're bringing people into the business district. How do we capitalize on the organizations and the groups that are bringing people here? Guildhall, Hometown Coffee, Writers Theater are the ones that always come to mind first and foremost. But I will tell you, the library wasn't necessarily front of mind for me. And when that fact was shared on Monday night at their meeting, it's like, oh, okay. So we're seeing this, and somebody turned to me at that meeting and said, well, if the library goes through with these changes and they want to improve the building, do we have enough parking to support it? So those are going to be the first questions that people ask too. How do we help manage moving the chess pieces around a really kind of set chessboard? Chessboard's not growing. But we may have to be more thoughtful, more aggressive about contemplating development in a very Glencoe specific way. Lots of people saying we don't want to be Evanston, we don't want to be Highland Park, we don't want to be Wilmette. I don't think anybody in this room wants to be those 3 communities either. But we also know that there are opportunities perhaps that we have not availed ourselves of that we should at least be talking about. Because it is, so much of what we've been talking about for the last several months is there are people that come to this community that we want We want them to, but we derive perhaps not very much from those visits. How can we derive more, or how can we get them to come back more frequently? How can we get them to move here? Those are all parts of a broader policy discussion, I think, that we are really at the, I don't want to say we're at the beginning stages. I think the comprehensive plan was the beginning stages. And now as it wraps up, it's also about not just putting that thing on a shelf and saying, okay, great, we'll look at it in 20 years again. But how do we put it into practice, into action, so that some of what we're talking about tonight, this morning, sorry, is made somewhat easier because we have augmented or helped to change some of the dynamic that we've gotten comfortable with. So again, and I won't say that that's easy. There will be controversy that ties to that. But I think it's a conversation worth having. It's a plan worth discussing and making. Because it'll make it easier for future boards and staff to actually accomplish the work that the village is going to have to continue to accomplish. So, sorry.
Do have to be a little bit of a wet blanket, which Bill loves to tell me. Sorry.
That's Nikki's middle name. Yeah.
As sobering as this conversation's been, I do want to just caveat that these projections do not contemplate any type of pension sweetener or rollback of tier 2. Obviously, if that were to happen, we would need to do some calculations and come back to the finance committee, come back to the board and talk about what that would mean, right? Because we're talking about large dollars, it's a big impact. In the meantime, Bill and I are doing everything we can in terms of participating in our councils of government and talking to our legislators to prevent that from happening, or at least compel the legislators to be smart about how that would happen. So I just wanted to say that the 5-year forecast, we're assuming status quo, that it's going to continue how we expect it to continue.
And that's not just us putting our heads in the sand. There hasn't been legislation actually introduced. There have been conversations about that legislation. And our hope is that those conversations result in, okay, we're not going to move it forward, but to Nikki's point, that's where the councils of government, and we're assembling data. All of the members of the Northwest Municipal Conference have been encouraged to share information about changes to tier 2 and how that would roll through our own finances. So it is something that is front of mind for us and for the whole region.
It's over. Thank you for hanging in there. So are there any other questions or comments about what we talked about today that you haven't brought up yet? So the feedback that you've shared this morning will be rolled into our draft budget document. So we're feverishly working to bring that to a close. That will come to all of you in early November. I'm not going to say a date right now because we're still working on it. But then
the meeting is the 19th of November. We're anticipating getting it to you about 10 days before that.
So that you have a chance ahead of time to take a look at it. And then we'll also present detailed fee recommendations to you in November as well. That will go along with it.
Question, I know that we all have in the projections for years going out include floating bonds for capital. To what extent have the amounts of those bonds been adjusted at all as we're looking at all of the things that we've just talked about?
I'd say that's a great question, Gary. I would say right now, we haven't had to modify any of the financing from last year as it was presented. So we still have, there may be some conversations about expediting the alternate revenue bonds for water or looking into a federal or state loan for water. But right now, I think we're still projecting general obligation bonds in 27. And alternate revenue bonds in 26, I believe. And the projection for the 10-year CIP, I don't have that handy, but it's still consistent with what we had last year.
Yeah, I think we're on a referendum schedule of 2026.
I believe it's 2026 to issue in 27.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just want everybody to just have sort of in the back of their minds the notion that we can figure out, you know, depending upon what happens in November with the referendum and all, but assuming the worst and planning for it, that unless we want to cut back services, and we've had that discussion, unless, you know, something strange happens or more federal money is suddenly available, it's, you know, other sources, that we're going to have to take care of ourselves. And that might require a more aggressive bonding plan that currently exists. And that's all there is to say about it at the moment. These are all projections, which is another very eloquent way of saying guesses. And educated guesses, but nonetheless.
Thank you. And Gary, just one thing I do want to add, because I know we've mentioned it in the treasurer's report, and we haven't really talked about it, but we will be talking about it with the budget. Is that we do have that second installment of the golf referendum bonds. We had tentatively planned in the CIP to issue a portion of that this year and a portion of that next year. It's October 16th. It's not happening this year. So we would issue the remainder of those bonds in one series in 2025. And that was just kind of one slight deviation from our financing plan. That doesn't change the overall dollar. Any other questions for the home stretch? Okay.
Again, I just want to say, you know, thank you. I won't even claim to imagine how many hours you all have spent thinking about this, talking about it, working the numbers, and I know you're still at it. Thank you all very much for your efforts.
Thank you, Gary. Okay. So our last item on the agenda is the 2024 property tax levy. So this property tax levy would attach in December of 2024 if the village board approves the levy. And then that would be collected in 2025. As we mentioned earlier, the Illinois Department of Revenue is allowing us to increase the property tax levy by 3.4%. That applies to property tax levy lines excluding our debt service. So anything that we have for GO bonds would not be included in that cap. It would be just kind of our general corporate levy, the levy that we issue for pensions, and then also the levy that we issue on behalf of the library. So the total levy, including debt, if I add in debt service and library to look at the whole picture, is 18.4 million. It's a $477,000 increase from the extension. So I'm going to play with percentages here a little bit because I wanted to break this down so you could see it with and without debt service. If we look at the village levy, excluding the debt service, it's an increase of $500,000. So I know we just talked about that, like meaning $500,000. So if we increase the property tax levy by the full amount, I'm also assuming a modest amount of growth that would allow us to exceed that 3.4% in that tax levy. That will ultimately be determined by Cook County, what we are able to levy. That's a 4.09% increase. Again, the Cook County will take a look at that. They will cut us down accordingly, but that is what we are projecting for the village alone. The library is following suit. They're assuming a little bit of new growth in EAB and market value for them. Their proposed increase is just shy of 4%. When we look at the debt service levy, it's actually going down by 5.5%. I wish I could take credit for that, but there's no magic in that. It's just the way that our debt service is scheduled. The payments happen to be going down this year. So that's an offsetting decrease of 142,000. So that's how we arrive at an overall, when we look at everything all included, it's a 2.65% increase because there's some increases there. So that's the draft levy. And the next page is the detailed line by line item. You can see what I'm projecting for EAV. EAV, it's about, I don't know, 83,000 in additional taxes, if EAV grows the way that I'm projecting it to grow. And then overall, on the very bottom line, you can see a 2.65% increase. What this does not include is there was a state law that was enacted, I believe in 21, that allows the village to recoup dollars from property tax refunds that are deducted from our distributions throughout the year. Unfortunately, we have no way of projecting that. So I can't include it here because we will not find out the number until June or July of next year.
And it can be upwards of a couple $100,000.
It can, and in trying to estimate that, it's varied from 75,000 to 300,000, and it all depends on how successful folks are in disputing their taxes. That is to just clarify that additional dollar amount that comes to us is timing related. So if we were to levy $10 million and there was 300,000 of refunds that came out, we would get 10 million less 300,000 that year. And then the 300,000 would come next year. So it's really, we're not getting a windfall by doing this. We're just getting the money that we asked for late. But it is a nice change in the law because previously we just wouldn't get that money. So one of the recommendations for the tax levy would be to set the November board meeting as the tax levy hearing date will be November 21st. So we'll provide a presentation of the proposed levy at that point. I would expect that we would have a formal letter from the library recommending their formal request for a levy at that time. So we would publish notice of the hearing in the paper, and then the final levy would be presented for the village board's approval in December. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Whatever happened to the grocery tax?
So the governor's proposal for the budget this year did eliminate the grocery tax. But because of President Roan's involvement and many of our other elected officials in the area coming to the table and talking to our legislators, we did get the implementation of the elimination pushed back to January 1 of 26. So we do expect that to be a $200,000 loss in grocery tax. Along with the elimination of the grocery tax, the governor gave non-home rule communities the ability to either levy a sales tax or levy your own grocery tax.
Or both.
Or both. And he was essentially put that onus onto the local governments to say, we're not going to do it at the state level, but the local governments can make that choice. What we have seen with our council of governments and our surrounding communities is there are some efforts in regions to implement a grocery tax or implement a tax at the same time so that you don't have an issue where folks are leaving Glencoe and going to Northbrook to do their grocery shopping because there's not a tax there, but there's a tax here. So there is an effort to kind of regionalize those efforts, but we don't have to take action until 2025.
Next year's.
Yes.
And you have to do so by October next year, so it can be implemented at the state level, but that is, it came up last week with Senator Morrison. All of the North Shore community that represented, nobody's committing to it, everybody's talking about it. And to Nikki's point, the conversation really is, if we're gonna do this, we should do this together.
So we have different names, Sunset. North Brook has a sunset, Highland Park has a sunset. If they don't have a tax, probably not gonna have a tax. But if they do, then we can. And, you know, I think our residents would probably be okay with that.
And that's why we're talking about it at a regional level. Right. But we also will have to find those resources if we elect not to do it, and that's not getting any easier. So it's a rock and a hard place, but a brilliant political move on the governor's part.
So released in the forecast and not program. I'm assuming, because I'm just assuming that the board will enact, we will make a change.
Yeah.
Regardless of what that
We'll know
means.
better since we're gonna
Right.
start.
We'll know soon.
Next year.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The only other thing, we passed out light the lights. If anyone has any concerns, we sent this information out a couple weeks ago in the Friday report, but just to make sure we're compliant with our donation policy, we want to make sure you had a chance to see this. It's pretty much the same as we've done in past years for sponsorship opportunities for them. See you, Jen.